This video, we are starting on a new subject, the rule of law. In this chapter, we'll discuss the Constitution, the balance of powers, principle of legality, criminal law, civil administrative law, but first we'll dive into the origin and the whole concept of the rule of law. We have to go back to the 17th and 18th century when there were absolute kings whom held absolute power, and the rights of we the people were, well, limited if they had any, because they were surely not safeguarded. Some philosophers started thinking about different ways to govern and to protect we the people against these absolute kings. One of these thinkers was John Locke, who believed that all people had nature rights, the same rights that accounted for everyone, such as we now call them human rights, such as the freedom of speech, equality, or the freedom of religion. And these nature rights, and that's more likely an idea of Rousseau, should be safeguarded in a social contract, a contract between we the people and the government, in which the government's power is limited, but also the duties of we the people are safeguarded, meaning that in a constitution you will not only find that what limits the power of the government, or for example the human rights, but you will also find obligations of we the people, such as the obligation to pay taxes to make the government possible in any way. A third very important thought was the idea of the trias politica. Montesquieu actually came up with this idea looking at King Louis XIV, le roi d'Ancey, the very example of the absolute king, also known as the Sun King, whom held absolute power in France and abused his power only for his own good, could govern any way he pleased. And Montesquieu wrote a reaction on that. He thought that the power should never be held by only one person, because if one person holds too much power, this power will corrupt this person, and it will only lead to bad government. It will only lead to someone abusing his power for his own good. Therefore, he believed that the power should be divided over three different bodies, which is the legislative power, the executive power, and the judicial power. I will now leave it for that, for in a later movie, or hopefully real lesson, I will dive deeper into the trias politica and what it means, because we talk about the trias politica as a strict division of these powers, but it actually comes with the question if it's a real separation, or as it's also a basis for the Dutch government, but maybe more a balance of powers. But as said, we'll discuss it later in paragraph 3 of this chapter. Now let's look at the idea of the rule of law. In this picture that you see next to the text, you see that equality is all at the top. This is the basis of the rule of law. Equality for everyone. And this equality is laid down in the Constitution, which is, well, the social contract of the Netherlands, a constitution that finds its origin in 1848, where Thorbecke got the assignment to write a new constitution. So it's not the first constitution. Actually, the first constitution-like document was already written in 1798. but it's this Thorbecke got the assignment to write a new constitution in which the power of the king was completely limited. Actually, was stripped of any form of power, and the power came with a elected parliament. So actually, the highest power now, the sovereignty, now came to lie with the people who elected a parliament, and from that parliament then a cabinet was formed, as we've discussed before, and this cabinet would be controlled by this parliament. Anyway, in this constitution there are three things that are very important. The first thing, it guarantees that all people have the same basic rights. All people are equally guaranteed the same basic rights. Next to that, it limits the power of the government, and since the constitution can hardly be changed, or it's very hard to change it, you need a 2/3 majority in the second chamber to actually want to change it, but also we'll come to that later. Anyway, it makes sure that the limit of the power of the government is bolted, and that the government cannot change anything quickly to just abuse its position. And it also safeguards the principle of legality, which means that our liberties, our freedom, can only be limited by restrictions that are laid down in a law that applies to everyone. So it's a generally written law. It's general, it's clear, and it's applicable, which means that it can be applied as well. But most importantly, it's general. You cannot single out one group. So it makes sure that these basic rights, as also already said in the first thought, are equally guaranteed. Well, and as said, this constitution finds its origin in 1848. On an international level, they actually went further. After World War II, the United Nations were formed, and in the United Nations they quickly came with what we now know, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In 1948. 1984 is a great book you should read, of George Orwell. But in 1948, they came with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is not something you can really go back to and say, we have these rights, we claim it based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because it's more like a promise. They promise to base constitutions on this document. That's an intention declaration. Unlike the European part of it, where all European countries actually signed it, and you can go to European Court and have human rights enforced. Well, we'll come to that later as well. So far for the introduction and the idea of the concept and the origin of the rule of law. Toodles!